It's time to wake to sleep with Sleep Science Today, where we learn to sleep well with your host, Andrew Colsky on UK Health Radio.
Welcome to another episode of Sleep Science Today, where we talk about sleep and the science behind sleep. I'm your host, Andrew Colsky, and today we're going to be talking about sleep as relates to high performers. And when I say high performers, I mean high performers of all types. Our guest today is a high performer himself, Dan Ford, coming all the way from New Zealand, and he is a sleep psychologist. So Dan, welcome to the show, and please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. I don't know so much about the high performer myself, but I like to keep myself busy. So in terms of my background, so I work as a sleep psychologist, and I run my own clinic out in New Zealand called the Better Sleep Clinic. However, prior to this, I actually spent around 10 years in the military, where I was in uniform with the Army, but across that time I had postings to Army, Navy, Air and Special Operations. So tried to see a little bit of each bit of the world, and then after that, after I left the military, I spent some time with High Performance Sport New Zealand, and I was with some Olympic teams, cycling for example, and also some of our professional teams such as in rugby, which is quite a big thing down here in New Zealand, and some other sports which might be a little bit more obscure in the States. And then I've also worked across just with individual athletes across different sports and that sort of thing. One of my little side things out of all that has been working with, I guess you'd call them, we call them consultants here in terms of their medical grade or life, but they're sort of the top of the food chain. They're coming to the end of all their training, and they're going to sit some big exams that are basically over here means you're either going to go forward with your career that you've invested all this time in, or you're gone and you're going to have to retrain into another medical specialty. So there's a lot of pressure in those moments, and so that happens to be the area where I still do a little bit of more performance-related work as opposed to sleep these days. So that's a little bit about me.
Wow, wonderful. A very accomplished career and a lot of varied things that you've done, from physical sports to mental, work. That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear it, and I'm so glad to have you here today. So, gosh, where to start? The one thing that comes to mind as my first question to you is, so you've had this incredible background of all these different things you've done, and here you are today with your own practice working with sleep. What got you to work with sleep as opposed to any of the other specialties you could have chosen?
Yeah, well, I guess the thing was that way back in the day when I started doing my studies in psychology, as I moved into my postgrad sort of master's level, I focused in on what we call behavioural psychology. So it's one of the branches of psychology, but it just so happens that that's where behavioural sleep medicine or the sleep psychology comes from. The interventions and that sort of thing, particularly with paediatrics, come out of very behavioural, and then off the back of that, the adult interventions have been developed from behavioural psychology as well. So that's what I was exposed to when I was coming through, and then I pretty much, and so my lecturers gave me some projects in that area, especially around paediatric sleep. So I was familiar with sleep, but then I sort of went away and did other things for around 15 to 20 years before, towards the end of my career in the military, I was asked to do some stuff around sleep with the unit that I was with. And after that, once I left, I thought I'd just go and do some sort of standard clinical psychology type work and see sort of all comers with different conditions. But then I got a phone call from the doctor from my old unit who said, "Hey, I've got this person with a sleep problem. Do you know anyone I can refer them to? Does anyone do this kind of stuff?" And I just sort of, dipped my toes back into sleep. So I was kind of like, well, to be honest, I don't, because there actually isn't really many people around in New Zealand doing that stuff. And so I said, well, send them to me. And that's the point where I realised actually, I really enjoy this. It's something that I could specialise in. There's no one else sort of in this area, and I've always sort of thought about doing the stuff that you're really passionate about, and so it just sort of made sense to narrow my focus down into this area. And then it also simplifies my life because everyone I see has a sleep condition before we have to get into all the other conditions they may have, and that's a really common thing, right? You're going to have physical health issues and also very commonly mental health issues when someone's got a sleep disorder. So all that stuff comes out the back, but I always say I like to have people come through the sleep door, and that just keeps my sort of me and my focus.
Wow. So, because this show is broadcast all over the world, actually, we've got 54 different English-speaking countries that listen. One of the things that I do when I talk with different guests is I try to learn about how sleep and sleep doctors and sleep medicine is in their country. So some of the things that we've talked about on prior shows would be in the U.S., for example, when someone goes for their medical degree, their psychology degree, their master's level counseling degree, they don't really get taught much, if anything at all, about sleep. And when a patient goes to a primary care physician for a checkup or a problem, in the U.S., it's rare for a doctor to ask about their sleep. In speaking with people from Europe, I've been told by them that one of the things that doctors generally always ask about is sleep. So that seems to be a much more prevalent question in Europe, yet there's a very small number of practitioners who actually practice sleep. So you're from New Zealand. I've not had the opportunity to ask anybody, what is it like there? Are there a lot of practitioners? Are people aware of sleep? Is it still a new area? Fill us in.
So in New Zealand, there is not a lot of people that specialise in sleep. I can count them probably on one hand,
Wow.
and including myself. So it's pretty sparse in terms of because as you note, people expect that their doctors probably had a lot of training, but there's been some really good studies done where they've actually found that on average people get maybe 1 hour in their entire medical career focused on sleep, and the rest of it is just picked up throughout different specialties. So New Zealand's, some of the universities are slightly different because I'm aware that one of them they get maybe 2 hours,
Wow.
so it's just not, there's just a real dearth of people with that expertise. So much the same, and I've never been asked anything about my sleep going to my general practitioner. So yeah, it's just not really that well understood. In fact, I've done training for our general practitioners to help them understand things like insomnia and that sort of thing.
Right. Wow. Would you say, is it something that appears to be becoming a little bit more well known? Like in the US, it's becoming slowly more well known. Doctors are starting to kind of catch on. Is it the same for you, or is it still kind of in the background?
It's hard for me to say, really. I think I always feel like we're running. Part of our job is to educate the public, including the professionals as well. So, but I mean, I do get asked by professionals from other fields like physios and chiropractors, and those sort of people often ask about, oh, you know, who can we refer to? So they're onto it because they know about their patients' conditions. But more often than not, I think when someone goes to their general practitioner, if they complain about their sleep, they're put onto an antidepressant. It's just assumed that it's still that assumption that it's a sub condition or it's a symptom of another condition, as opposed to this is something we should pay attention to.
Okay. Yeah, and that is really kind of the genesis of sleep medicine. As you and I both study sleep medicine, and one of the things that I've read a lot is about the fact that exactly that people used to think that sleep was just a side effect of something, not an actual condition of its own. And now we're learning that there's so many actual sleep conditions that are the primary condition, not a side effect. And I guess that's a good thing, because now we can become aware of it and then try and treat it. So you come from sort of this high performance type of background where you work with a lot of people that are high performers. And, what is it about sleep, if you had to kind of summarize it? Does sleep matter that much for high performers? Is it different for high performers? Why sleep in high performers?
End of the day, you're going to spend a third of your time on this earth in some sort of state of sleep. If you looked at it roughly, although it's probably a lot more, given that children spend a lot more of their time in sleep. But so it's going to be important straight up there. But then, when you think broadly about what happens while you're sleeping, your physical repair is going to happen during non-REM sleep, right, where you're going to spend about the first 2/3 of your night, and then we think that your emotional recovery is going to happen to a degree in the last third of the night when you're in REM sleep. And then, of course, throughout that time, you've got stage 2 non-REM sleep and to some degree during REM, where you're actually laying down. Your brain is going through a process of categorizing memories from the day and deciding we're going to transfer this to long-term memory or we're going to cut this one here. And so, different types of sleep are going to consolidate your procedural memory. So, if you're working with operators and you're in uniform yourself and you're learning your drills for your weapons, well, that's going to be consolidated when you're sleeping. And then, just like with athletes, their skills. And then, of course, when you're learning stuff in a more book context, which we call declarative memory, then that stuff is going to get laid down as well throughout the night. So fundamentally, you cannot divorce your sleep from your performance during the day, because it is basically, it is often where really the keys to your performance lie.
Mm-hmm. So, here, at least in the U.S., you'll hear some, I'll say, novice athletes, people who are, pretty good, but they're not professional athletes. And there seems to be, in some of those cases, this machismo where if I can get away without having to sleep, that makes me stronger and better, and I'm better than the other guy. Is there a similar type of machismo when you get into the professionals, or are they much more aware of sleep and its impact?
Again, it really depends on the context. I think with the sporting teams that I was with, they had some idea, like they'd been introduced to some concepts, very basically. But when I was in the military, we were a bit behind the US, certainly, because there's some pretty big sort of programs around sleep and sleep leadership. But in the military, we're definitely more likely to come across the kind of, we don't need to do that, or it's important to sleep deprive people as part of training or things like that. And there's probably, there's some good aspects of doing some things around sleep. But again, your performance itself is not going to, is probably going to suffer over time if you don't pay attention to your sleep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just, I don't know. It hurts me when I hear people talking about how they feel that they can kind of push through and sleep deprive themselves, and somehow that makes them bigger, better, stronger, when in reality it's actually making them weaker and worse. But, this is what it is. So I wanna move into an area and start talking about some of the common sleep challenges that athletes deal with. But before we do that, I'm going to take a quick break for a commercial, and then we will be right back on Sleep Science Today. You're watching Sleep Science Today. If you enjoy our show, please help support us by pressing the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell. It'll really help us get seen, and it'll help you stay informed. Okay, we are back on Sleep Science Today. I'm your host, Andrew Colsky. We're talking with Dan Ford, all the way from New Zealand. Dan is a sleep psychologist, and he works a lot with high performers. So before the break, I said, we want to talk about some common sleep challenges faced by elite athletes. And because you've done it yourself, and you are and have been an elite athlete, what types of things do athletes run into in terms of sleep issues that, become more important for their careers?
I haven't been an elite athlete myself. I just worked in those contexts, but certainly with the elite, I think with the elite athletes, and we'll sort of probably differentiate from the military context and that sort of stuff as well. But I think the really big one, if you spend any time talking about sleep with an athlete, it's going to come up, which is how do I sleep the night before a big event? Because that is going to be one of the common experiences that people have, is struggling to sleep before those big matches and that sort of thing. So there's definitely going to be one. And I think there was a study done out of Aussie so Australia, showing about sort of 60%, and then one in Germany about 80% of athletes at the top levels had said, I've struggled with my sleep before these big events. So that's kind of a one-off thing. They might not have any struggles anywhere else, but that's definitely going to be a thing. And then as you start to work with these teams, you start to notice these little things like, well, first of all, they're going to be sleeping in all different places. So when I was working with the cycling team, even when they weren't at the Olympics, they're going to the World Champs, but they might be with a professional team. So they might be based out of France, but the World Champs, so they're doing their day sort of job, professional stuff there. But then they have to, so they're away from home for a start, sleeping in a hotel perhaps, or some sort of team camp environment. But then they're going to go for maybe a national camp with the national team, and then they might go to a World Cup event, which is in another country. So they're crossing back and forth all the time. So at the minimum, they're sleeping in a lot of different places, which can raise issues for people. And then the other thing is you might be crossing time zones as well. So then you start to get circadian rhythm type disruptions when you're crossing a lot of time zones. So that's something you're going to notice. And then of course you've got things like, they might travel to somewhere like altitude. So when the New Zealand rugby teams go to, go play in South Africa, they go to places like Cape Town, which are at altitude. And you can get, altitude can have effects on breathing while you're sleeping and that sort of thing. And then of course you've got injuries, concussions, how do you get through those? And then actually, quite interestingly, all the different sports will have different kinds of risk profiles for things like sleep disorders. So if you think about a sport like NFL, or our sort of thing is rugby, your props are similar to your offensive tackles. Is that the big dudes, yeah? So they might be at risk for, just naturally at risk for obstructive sleep apnea, even if they're just a big, well-built dude and quite healthy, right? I think Shaq O'Neal was a guy who actually has obstructive sleep apnea, probably just because he's a big guy. He's not necessarily overweight and stuff, yeah. And then you've got, and so the different sports all have different profiles and risks sort of profiles for different things. And also when you're working in sport, you may also get down to the people in their teens, right? So those sort of prodigies. And then suddenly you get from the coaches, they're saying, this guy or this girl, really great athlete, they're 19 years old and they've made our top team, cannot make the practices at 6 a.m., and then you're sort of starting to think about body clock and that sort of thing, and those different challenges that come up across the lifespan. So actually they're kind of doing shift work as well, if they've got these early starts for training, or particularly late starts for training as well. So there's all these sort of variables and things that pose little challenges for athletes around their sleep.
Right. Wow. That was a long list of a lot of things, and some of them I thought about, and many of them I haven't thought about. And the one that strikes me is when you're talking about the teens and having to wake up super early to do their practices. A big thing here in the U.S. right now is our school start times, because teens naturally need more sleep. They naturally wake later, and our schools start, in some cases, what some people feel is too early. So by the time they get to school, they're exhausted, they're not well rested, they're not able to focus, and it actually harms their education. But when you got an athlete who's got to be up before school, even to go and practice, what do you do with them? How do you help them?
Well, I guess it's similar to what you would do for other interventions. For if you just had a teenager come in with say a delayed sleep phase disorder, so which is a circadian rhythm condition. But so you're starting to think about, okay, well, what can we do to improve this? But then you might also have to think about, well, maybe we should treat this more like a shift worker, because they don't have to get up at that time every day of the week. They only have to get up for these couple of days for these trainings. So it can become quite complicated. But the other thing, maybe just go to the coach and inform the coach and let the coach have some sort of idea that they're not struggling, they're not turning up late because they're because of some moral failing. They actually have a different sort of biological profile that makes it a lot harder for them to make this time compared to the other athletes.
Wow.
So yeah.
Do you find that the coaches and the other people sort of surrounding the athletes, do you feel that they understand when spoken with about sleep issues and the importance of sleep for athletes?
In my experience, not so much. If I happen to be giving a talk on sleep, probably the people that aren't there often are the coaches. And yeah, so and that's the thing as well, because often the coaches are ex-players, so they don't necessarily, so they've come through a system, and then they sort of have their ideas about how things should be. So because I did that in my day, sort of thing. So often they're not paying attention to those sort of things because they didn't pay attention to them when they were an athlete. So often the current generation is much more well versed in this stuff, and the coaches are getting pulled along into this. One of the teams I worked with, the coach had insomnia. The doc said, "I think the coach should come and see you," but did the coach come and see me? No. So that's the thing. You got these funny sort of dynamics, and so it's just one of those things. Yeah.
Wow, wow. Well, let's compare and contrast that to military. Now, military, obviously, I can imagine it's important to be able to deal with what comes your way, and sometimes you're not going to be able to sleep for obvious reasons. You've got other things that are a little bit more important at the time. But at the same time, at some point, it's important to get sleep so that you can be refreshed and able to function. So, are there similarities and differences between what you might see from sports, figures, and then military?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of similarities, but you've hit on the big difference with the military, which is that it's kind of on steroids in terms of the challenges, right? Because you might be on a when you're with the special ops guys, they're on a notice to move, so you could be mowing your lawn, and then 2 hours later you're dropping off your bags at the airport, and the next day you're in Syria. So so it's very fast turnarounds like that. Whereas if a sports team, like a national team, especially if they land in another country, they're going to have planned it so that they can get there, adjust to the time zone and stuff like that before they have to go and do their job. But the operator will have to basically turn up the moment they get off the plane, and be expected to start performing. And then, of course, all those different locations. The great one was where guys that were deployed overseas, and their room, as they came off the night shift, their room was the wall between them and the gym, and so they are trying to sleep, and the gym is the biggest, because there's nothing else in that location except the gym,
Right.
and so everyone's going to the gym in any off time they get, and these guys are trying to sleep at that time. So so then you have to sort of start to think about, well, maybe there's just things they need to take with them. Is it earplugs or whatever, to be able to do that? So there's all those sort of challenges, but then you've got some extra ones, right? Because as you go through your career, then you get exposed to more stuff, and so then you've got the things like PTSD coming into play, and people don't always realise that. So I'll be thinking about that with the more experienced operators as opposed to the newbies. especially in a context like New Zealand where you don't see as much sort of action when you're in the big army. But so the what people don't always realise is that with something like PTSD, because it's kind of like a systemic condition, you can see things that you wouldn't expect to see with a young guy or a younger person, such as REM behaviour disorder. Right, so people lose the paralysis that they have during REM sleep and start thrashing about and punching people and all this sort of stuff. You can have that. Typically, you only see that with old men and women. That's the sort of group that we typically think about it. So over the age of 60, but you can actually see it in younger people who have post-traumatic stress and these sorts of things. So then these sort of sleep problems come up as well. And then, and it just depends on where someone is at in their career. A funny story, when you come into the military, into the special operations, you go into training for a sort of a good couple of years to get up to speed with all the different skill sets and that. And I did some testing around sleep with these guys, and they all had really, really terrible scores on the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. I thought, this is really weird. These guys are just under training. Why is he so bad? And then eventually someone said to me, oh, you know what it is? Because we're all kind of quite new to the environment, and we just we do everything that the physical training instructors will tell us to. And they said, you've got to hydrate a lot. You've got to hydrate a lot. So we've all been drinking all this water all day, and all of us are getting up all night to go to the toilet, and this guy's slamming the door, and then someone else is slamming the door, and so all of their sleep quality is destroyed by them all sort of drinking too much liquid and having to go to the loo, and because they're in a sort of at a communal sleeping environment. So each other up and that. So I thought that was quite funny. I thought there was something really serious going on here, but yeah.
Well, I love that story only because when we talk about the concept of behavioral sleep medicine, and we deal with people with insomnia, and we deal with people with nightmares and other types of things, it's so important to do exactly what you just described there, is to understand their environment, to not just assume, oh, it's insomnia, so we apply this treatment to it, but to really understand the bigger picture. What else is going on? What's leading to this? What might be impacting it? What might be preventing you from benefiting from treatment? And so often that's just kind of looked over, and we make the assumption, insomnia, we apply this technique, move forward. And that's not the way it is at all in behavioral sleep medicine. Wow. I love that. That's an excellent story. So, I want to move on and talk a little bit about comparing medical professionals now to what we've talked about. But before we do that, I'm going to take another commercial break, and we'll come back and talk about medical professionals. So stick with us here on Sleep Science Today. You're watching Sleep Science Today. If you enjoy our show, please help support us by pressing the like button, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell. It'll really help us get seen, and it'll help you stay informed. Okay, we're back. I'm your host, Andrew Colsky, on Sleep Science Today. We're talking with Dan Ford, a sleep psychologist in New Zealand. And now we have a question that I've always been curious about. In the U.S. anyway, and I'm going to ask you whether this is the same in New Zealand or not. In the U.S., I know that when people study for their medical doctor type of degree, they end up doing a residency, and they do shifts overnight in the hospital, and they are expected to be up for very lengthy periods of time. And I never understood why, and quite honestly, I still don't understand why. I would think that would be dangerous to have a very sleepy doctor working with very sick patients because of the propensity for mistakes that could happen. So my questions to you are, number one, does New Zealand do it the same way? Number two, if they do you have any idea why? And number three, do you have any comments about just dealing how the medical professionals themselves can deal with sleep issues and what sleep issues they see?
Answer to the first question is that it is the same here. Yes, they're going to do long hours and shifts, and and so changing shifts all the time and that sort of thing. The answer to the second question is I have no idea. Well, and I've forgotten the third question already. But I think the part of what I've seen is I think it's a little bit of a mentality as well that there is kind of, when I have moved through these different organisations with the elite performers, there is a sort of thing of, we are elite performers. And the doctors to some degree are like that too, and so there's this idea that we can do this, because we're more capable than other people and that sort of thing. So there's a bit of that comes through from some, and so I think that can drive some of that as well. But it is probably the worst situation is when you're doing long, 10, 12-hour shifts, and then you are doing them with a rotating schedule as well. So terrible for your health, which is ironic because they are our health practitioners.
Right, right. And I guess that kind of gets into one of the things you were talking about before, comparing like the teen athletes to sort of this shift work concept. So my third question to you was about comparing and contrasting what medical professionals have to deal with to military to elite athletes. Are there unique challenges and things for medical professionals, and have you worked with them, and what types of issues have you worked with?
Yeah, so I think the big difference with them, of course, compared to all the others, is that they're in that sort of stable location, if you like. They're not sort of moving around all over the place typically, but then they are on this rotating schedule all the time, and doing really long hours, and in quite a demanding job too. So you do see what we call shift work disorder. That's quite prevalent, and so either trouble sleeping in your designated sleep time, trouble staying awake when you're supposed to be working, or a combination of the two. And so that's a really big one. And then in terms of the performance stuff that they have is, people don't always realize, well, over here, at the end of, as you go through all your training, eventually you're progressing kind of like a rank structure. That's how I sort of think about it because from the military background. But at the top rank, you're a consultant. I forget what it's called in the US, but something similar. But basically, you have to pass an exam here, and if you fail that, you fail out of your exams. You get a number of tries, but if you fail, basically you're yanked. You can't progress, or stay in that particular specialty. You have to go somewhere else. So I was working with someone who they've been, I think they started in neurology. Then they were in, I think it was general surgery, and they were struggling there, and so it was really, the pressure was coming on, right? Because what are they going to do then? But also one of the differences too then will also be that they're at a different life stage. They're typically in their, at least their mid-30s, and if they're getting later into the, then they've got the kids and all that sort of stuff that they're trying to juggle around, not only this job but also all the study and stuff like that. So the pressure really piles in on them, and that's a written and an oral exam as well.
Wow. I mean, that my frame of reference is law school, because having gone to law school, our entire grade was based on one final exam in each class. You didn't have quizzes, you didn't have any other grades to draw from. So when it came to the end of the semester and you've got 4 or 5 classes, you're cramming because you have to relearn the entire semester's worth of material in detail for all of these classes, and to be able to pass, you got to do well on that exam. And they're not easy exams, and the professors, just out of pure fun for them, they make them complicated on purpose, and they try to throw you a little bit. So you really have to be focused. And you talk about sleep and preparation. I'll never forget. I graduated law school, and when we finish law school, you have to go take a bar exam. And a bar exam is incredible. Oh my God, months and months of studying. And you get 2 days where you're sitting in an auditorium taking this exam. So I went to the bar exam. My first night, I got a hotel close to the convention center. And I figured, great, I can just walk across the street. I'll be set. I'm good. I go to bed. I wake up in the morning to get prepared for going off to my first day of the exam. And I go to turn on the shower. And all I get is this brown, rusty, cold water. Their pipes or something had broken the night before. I couldn't even take a shower. I like a nice warm shower in the morning to wake up. Couldn't do it. I had to go in and take my exam the whole day. I'll never forget that. It was miserable.
Well, I mean, I've only seen it with the exam performers, but they will have panic attacks. I've had people that just have a panic attack every time they sit down to study. Just boom. It gets that, they get that worked up. Yeah. But anyway.
Because everything is writing on it. It's not like you don't get a second chance.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about when people have an opportunity to prepare. So like you mentioned, you have athletes who know that they're going to be going and they're going to be playing a game where they're in a different time zone and maybe even in a different elevation. What types of things can they do, if anything, to help prepare for that?
Well, you asked me the hard one, because there's not a lot of good, really good interventions that, you can't say hand on heart, this one's going to sort of do the trick. We do make a difference, a differentiation between the circadian, so the body clock disruption of the travel, versus just the fatigue from travel as well. Because if you just get on a plane and you sit, because of the pressurized environment and stuff like that, you get dehydrated and all that. So there's that bit to sort of iron out. And some of the strategies can be things like thinking about, there's been some evidence that if you shift your meal timings prior to going to the new location, so you start eating on that schedule, then you can adapt a little bit faster, because one of the things that feeds back to your, there's a few things that feed back to that master clock in the brain, apart from bright light, which everyone sort of knows about, but there's actually the timing of your meals, and the timing of your exercise, and just your daily rhythm and routine as well. But so shifting the meals a little bit earlier can be helpful. And of course, you got all those good tips on travel, like keep hydrated. Probably don't eat the airplane food. Eat something fresh and healthy if you can. And then when you get to the new environment, you want to be thinking about where you're putting your trainings and time of day and that sort of thing, and making sure people get exposure very quickly to the light dark cycle in the new location, that sort of thing. But just being careful in those first few days too, because you don't want to go out and have someone injure themselves unnecessarily because they're fatigued or a bit out from the travel. So yeah, when you have the time, and giving the athletes a little kit or something to take away with them for the plane and all that sort of thing. So just some little things like that. And there's also a few. There's a few apps that try and do a little bit around the timing of things as well. I forget what their names are now off the top of my head, but yeah. So there's a few little things there for preparing for those sort of things.
So in your personal experience, in talking with people in the different sporting careers, do the coaches or the team owners or whoever is a decision maker, do they even think about that now in terms of, okay, we're going to a different time zone, we're going to be, having to be refreshed to be able to prep for the game? Do they plan out to get there a couple days in advance to adjust? Do they think about trying to adjust, like you said here, beforehand? Or is that really up to the individual athlete?
I think some of the professionals think about it. So occasionally I've been, just the other day I was contacted by someone saying, hey, a psychologist working with a team saying, hey, I'd like to get you down to go over some of the stuff with us and talk to the team. But that does also signal that often it's not really that thought about by the coaches, or they're not aware that there's things you can do to try to optimize that a bit more. So it might fall onto the doctor perhaps, or someone else in the team if they don't have a psychologist. So yeah, my perception is it's not really well understood.
Wow. You would think that, it's so important to understand that, because if your whole goal is trying to win the game. Well, how are you going to win the game if your athletes are not at their peak? Can't be at your peak if you're falling asleep.
Well, I mean, they've done those studies, right? And they've looked at the basketball teams crisscrossing the states, and what are their win-loss records when they're travelling. And often, there's a disadvantage for the travelling team, mainly because of the time zone, going through different time zones and that. So yeah, so you could, it is an area where teams could definitely improve their performance and return on investment.
Right. Wow. Okay. Well, we're just about out of time, so I want to ask you, because we're talking about high performers here, and we're talking about everything from military to professionals to athletes to anyone who's, high performer. And it could be someone who's not in one of those jobs, who's just a high performing person. Do you have any tips that you think would be most important for them to think about when it comes to starting to think about sleep and its relation to high performers?
Yeah, I think, we've touched on the importance of it, but there was one thing that I touched on before, which we haven't really talked about, which is that what do you do the night before that big event and you can't sleep, right? Because that's something that probably everyone's going to experience sometime in their life. And so one of the key things that I talk to athletes about is that, if you can't sleep, you can't force it, right? Because it's a natural process, just like sitting down at dinner, you either feel hungry or you don't. And if the stress activation is there, you may not be as sleepy. So the first thing is, the night before, it's probably not that good idea to go to bed early to try to get a bit more extra sleep in, because it'll make it even harder. And so it's about listening to your body. And if you can't sleep, don't get worked up, right? Because at the end of the day, the very stress, that stress activation that's keeping them awake, when you ask people, well, what do you think the chances are, if you didn't sleep that well tonight, what's the chances that you walk into the stadium tomorrow and at kickoff, suddenly you're like, right, I need to take a nap. Right? They say, oh, there's no chance, my stress system's activated, I'm ready to go. And I say, exactly, right? So don't stress about it. Because the worst thing that you can do is spend 4 or 5 hours struggling to get to sleep, getting upset about the whole situation. The next day, that will show up in your performance, because you'll be fatigued and stuff like that. But if you just accept, hey, look, it's okay, my body will help me out tomorrow, and I'll just do some stuff that is important to me. If it's go over the game a bit more because that's important to you, or if it's just do some other health types, look after yourself in some other way, and chill out a bit because that's important to you, then do that stuff. But don't try to force your sleep, because it'll just make the situation worse.
Sounds like a very important piece of advice, and you're absolutely right about what you're saying. I think that's a great tip. So thank you for sharing that with us. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us on the show and explain your experiences and all the wonderful information that you've had to share. So this is Sleep Science Today. I'm your host, Andrew Colsky. We've been talking with Dan Ford, a sleep psychologist. I do want to remind our listeners to please visit sleepsciencetoday.com, sign up for our mailing list so that we can get you updates on important information. If you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and subscribe to us, because we want to share this message with people as broadly as we can. So, Dan, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for listening listening to Sleep Science Today and learning how to sleep better with your host, Andrew Colsky, on UK Health Radio. For more information on how you can achieve better sleep, go to sleepsciencetoday.com. Remember, sleep science today and sleep better tonight.